Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to discuss what the fair value of Bitcoin likely will be at the next halving in 2024. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothe.cryptoverse.com. Now, in this video, we're going to take a stroll down memory lane. We're going to talk about some prior projections we put out back in 2019 and 2020. Talk about some things that seem more or less in line with what happens, and some things that aren't, that didn't play out in the way that I sort of saw back then. But I want to go through this so people really understand my current perspective on the market. Okay, as you guys know, I've been relatively bearish recently, albeit I do think we could easily have a relief rally in the coming weeks. But even then, I don't really anticipate Bitcoin seeing a surge to new highs this year. Okay, we're just sort of going through that bear market phase, and whether you like it or not, that is currently where we are. So what I want to do is we want to talk about the fair value of Bitcoin. Okay, this is different. And when I say fair value in this context, I'm talking about fit to non-bubble data, not all data. Okay, so there's one regression line that we sometimes talk about, which is fit to all data. And perhaps I will just bring that up so you can see what I'm talking about. It's this one right here. It's the yellow line. That's fit to all data. Okay, I'm talking about the green one, fit to, again, quote unquote, non-bubble data. And what we've noticed, and what we said a long time ago, is that the price of Bitcoin tends to correspond to the fair value fit to non-bubble data at the Bitcoin halving. Okay, so for instance, in 2012, the halving the price was, or the fair value was around $13, and the price was not far off from $13. At the second halving in 2016, the fair value was $650. At the third halving, it was $8,000. When we first made this video, though, we were still about 6 months before the next Bitcoin halving. And actually, at the time, the price of Bitcoin was actually around the same price that it would be at the halving. But look at what happened between November of 2019 and the halving, right? You can see we went all the way down to 3,800, and then we bounced back up to the fair value by the next Bitcoin halving. Okay, so when we talked about this, we said, what is non-bubble data, right? How do you come up with this? Well, it's somewhat subjective, right? But I came up with some mathematical exercise back then to basically distinguish between what I would consider non-bubble data and bubble data. And you can kind of see I highlighted the data points that I used in this calculation in red, and everything that was in sort of just in blue is excluded from the calculation of the fair value regression curve. So it only includes the the red data points, okay? And I use this, and I only fit it through data going into early 2019. And despite that, you can see that it was fit through data around here, okay? But it still did a relatively good job of continuing to identify the accumulation phase that continued on, right? This continued accumulation phase, just like we had in the prior cycle as well, and just like we had in the cycle before that. Okay, so you can see that this happens every single time before you get a fresh Bitcoin bull market. Okay, and furthermore, the thing that I want people, because going in line with the title of the video, we want to talk about what is the fair value of Bitcoin by the next halving. And the reason why that's important is because I think there's a lot of anxiety right now in the market. There are a lot of people constantly worried that they're going to miss Bitcoin's pump to 100K or something. But realistically speaking, given the fact that we've identified for months now that Bitcoin is in a bear market, and we are just in a general, we're in a macro risk off time, there really is no real reason to assume that Bitcoin is about to go to 6 figures, unfortunately. Okay, we recognize that it is a bear market. It has all the characteristics of a bear market in terms of putting in lower lows, the dominance going higher, all Bitcoin pairs bleeding. We've seen this many times before, and there's no reason to assume this time is different when you've seen it happen multiple times and it's played out the exact same way. Okay, so with that in mind, could we have relief rallies? Of course, we probably will. I mean, I even put out a video a few weeks ago saying that I think we're going to have a relief rally for Bitcoin coming up in the next few weeks that could even take us back to 40K for all I know. But I want to talk about how you can best plan for the next several years with Bitcoin and how you can have the right mindset to navigate the cryptoverse right now. Okay, so we know, at least if history is any indication, that the price of Bitcoin corresponds to the fair value if it's non-bubble data at the halving. Okay, we said this, we've mentioned this many times before. You can see in 2019, this was November 24th, 2019. We talked about, at the halving, the fair value would be around $8,000. I think we were just slightly above it, maybe like 8,500. And then we made a follow-up video, at the actual halving, saying that we would expect, Bitcoin's price to be at around, right, $8,000 at the halving. And it was, okay? But then we continued that projection out to the fourth halving, okay? And, despite the fact that this video was made 2 years ago, I still think it's valid for the fourth halving. And if I just sort of fast forward, this is what it looks like, okay? So this is certainly the actual timing of the peak. I didn't get correct when I drew it out back then, right? I did not get that correct when I drew it out back in 2020. In fact, we had a peak in early 2021, and that was where it happened quicker than I thought it would. And just to be completely honest, I mean, I took a lot of profits in early 2021 because, the risk levels went crazy. And then the second peak in late 2021 sort of threw me off to some degree because, it was more or less a double top and the risk levels didn't go as high. But what you'll notice, though, is despite the fact that, we didn't really hit that 100K threshold, we still likely make our way back to whatever the fair value is by the next halving. So in this instance, I drew it happening later on, and if it had happened later on, I do think Bitcoin would have gone higher than 69K. One of the reasons is if you go look at, say, the upper regression band, we tend to make it to it, even though we only brushed up against it very slightly. We do tend to make it to the upper regression band. So you could argue that if this mania phase had been delayed by another year, then perhaps we would have made it, to the six-figure milestone. However, unfortunately, we had a fairly impulsive rally that just took us straight up. All right. Something that I was also, this is sort of a tangent, but I was sort of noticing something, and I haven't really pointed it out before, but it is worth watching. Once we leave the green regression band, except for a few fake out, and we've had some fake outs, but oftentimes we just go straight up to the top, right? And we don't lollygag too much down here. You could argue this was a long accumulation phase, but really once we got out of the green regression band, we just went straight up to the top and then we came back down, right? We got out of it, we just went straight up to the top. So we'll be certainly looking out for that following the next halving. But in following up with what we said over here, we said, this was back in 2020 when the price of Bitcoin was $8,000. I said by the fourth halving, the fair value of Bitcoin will be around 40 to 50K. Okay, 40 to 50K. Now, does this make sense? Does it make sense to be 40 to 50K? Well, back here, the fair value fit to non-bubble data back in May of 2020 was around $8,000 at the third halving. You're essentially looking at a 5 to 6x or so to get you to the next halving, the fair value at the next halving. If you look at where we are today, and I've drawn in where the prior halvings were, again, you can see that every halving, we more or less hit the, sorry, I think I drew this one year too soon. November 2012 is when it should be. You can see that the price of Bitcoin at the halving is at the fair value, right? So it's at the fair value every single time. So if you were to extend this out, you can see now the fair value of Bitcoin fit to non-bubble data is in fact, currently it's just below $23,000. which coincidentally also corresponds to the 200-week moving average. Right? There's a lot of coincidences there. You can also see that last cycle we bottomed at the 200-week moving average, which also was at the fair value, and that also happened in the cycle before that as well. So personally, I think that we could see a relief rally, but I'm not convinced that 25K is the bottom. Okay, I'm certainly not. And given the fact that we still have, 22 months before the next Bitcoin halving, we certainly have plenty of time to test that theory as to whether 25K is actually the bottom. Now, one thing to consider, the bottom tends to correspond well before the halving. Okay, so for instance, in this cycle, the bottom occurred in November of 2011, but by the time we actually hit the halving, Bitcoin had already pumped almost 400%. In the cycle before that one, by the time we hit the halving, the price of Bitcoin had pumped 250% or so. From the cycle before that one, the price of Bitcoin by the time we hit the next halving had already pumped about 150%. So you can see this is around 350, this is around 250, this is around 150. So every single time the value of Bitcoin at the halving, it corresponded to the fair value, but it wasn't actually the cycle bottom. Okay, the cycle bottom was actually less, right? But the pump from the cycle bottom into what would be the fair value by the halving, you can see it's diminished each time. I think a lot of people have trouble envisioning Bitcoin going below the prior cycle's all-time high, but I think something to consider is that you can see that from this top to the next bottom, it was about a 400% move. But the following top to the next bottom, it was only about a 150% move or 200% move or so. So you can see that, yes, we've never tested a prior cycle's all-time high, but we did get closer on the second time than we did on the first, right? So this time we'll probably get even closer, if not even go below it, right? It's certainly a possibility. And it is the case with diminishing returns that you might see that. Now, the other thing with diminishing returns is that theoretically you'll also see diminishing losses. And we can see that normally these Bitcoin bear markets, they tend to not be quite as bad. So like the first Bitcoin bear market went down about 94%, but the second Bitcoin bear market only went down a very modest, like 87% or so. The third one, though, went down about 84%. So we have seen diminishing losses already. For instance, by the last cycle, by the time we hit the bottom, we had already, at the fair value, it was already an 84% drop. But from this all-time high to get to the fair value, it's only about a 70% drop or so. We could certainly go below it, as we've gone below it in the past. We've gone below the fair value in the past, but it just gives you an idea that we are potentially seeing diminishing losses as time goes on. So we sort of follow up on this video and say, well, does it make sense that Bitcoin's fair value at the next halving could be approximately $40,000 to $50,000? And I actually do think it makes a decent amount of sense. If you think about it, Bitcoin is already at 30K, okay? And if we were to speculate out on the next Bitcoin halving, we don't know exactly when it's going to be, but it's likely going to be sometime, let's say April 2024, okay? So let's draw it out right here. We'll say that's where the next Bitcoin halving is. Now, one of the things we can do is we can just sort of expand out these logarithmic regression lines, right? And just say, all right, well, this will continue to go up, something like that. And so will the the actual fair value part of it, and then the lower bound. Okay, this is obviously not an exact match, because the regression band does sort of fold over as time goes on, but it'll more or less look something like that. And you can see that if we expand this out, the fair value, which is currently at around $23,000 or just below it, by the time we hit April of 2024, the fair value of Bitcoin should be around 40K, which is what we said back in May of 2020, right? That by the 2024 halving, the fair value of Bitcoin should be around $40,000. Now, when thinking about that, how do we get to $40,000 by the next halving? Well, let's suppose that Bitcoin continues the bear market. Okay, so let's draw out some type of a path. Okay, so we're going to say, let's suppose we get that relief rally. A lot of times after putting in our first lower low, you do get a relief rally. That happened here in 2018, and it also happened in 2014 as well. So let's suppose the Bitcoin gets some type of relief rally. But also, normally the first lower low was not the cycle bottom, it was the second one. That also happened in 2014. So if this is the first lower low, let's suppose we do get a relief rally within the next month or two, and then we come back down to retest the bottom of this range. And then if we do end up falling back to the fair value by, let's say, like the end of the year or something, and maybe we'll sort of we'll move around in this area for some time, and perhaps you do get a capitulation below the prior all-time high, right? Something like that. But we could potentially work our way back up to be at around the fair value by the next Bitcoin halving. Okay, so that's certainly one path I think we would need to contend with. And what's interesting is that, if we continue to accelerate past that, we could be at 60K, or 70K or something by the end of 2024. And we could still be in the lower fair value regression band fit to non-bubble data, even though that $60,000 level would have corresponded to the prior cycle's all-time highs, right? But in a couple of years, that'll actually correspond to the fair value fit to non-bubble data. And so then if you get some type of a rally which takes you out of it, then you might see something like this where it quickly goes up to the upper regression band, and then we enter then into another bear market. Okay, so like if you just imagine sort of expanding this regression band out, something like that, we could certainly envision something like that playing out. Okay, so I think this is worthwhile to consider, and the reason why we're talking about it is because there's a lot of evidence that supports it, right? A lot. Not only from like a technical perspective, we can see that Bitcoin has put in a lower low, which we warned about many times. But once you put in a lower low, at least historically, it is not the cycle bottom. Okay, so for instance, like in 2014, the first lower low was not the cycle bottom; it was the second one. In 2018, the first lower low was not the cycle bottom; it was the second one. So I don't really assume that 25K is the cycle bottom, right? Could we have a pump, a relief rally back to 35K or 40K? Sure, we could. It doesn't mean that 25K is the bottom. And it just because Bitcoin went to 6K in July or, July of 2018 and it rallied back up to 8K, it still did not mean 6K was the bottom. We still eventually dumped 50% from 6K down to $3,000. Now, remember, one of the things we talked about is the percent difference from the market cycle bottom to the halving, and how after cycle 1 it was like 350%, cycle 2 was 250%, cycle 1 was 150%. I don't know exactly where the cycle bottom is going to be over here. If it's let's take best case scenarios, 25K, to be at 40K by the next halving, you're talking about just about a 60% move or so. If we end up bottoming out at say like 18K, then it would be about 130% by the next Bitcoin halving. So it is something to consider that Bitcoin's fair value by 2024 could in fact be where the price of Bitcoin is at the halving, because every single prior halving has occurred at the price where Bitcoin hit the fair value. It happened in 2012, it happened in 2016, and it also happened in 2020. So if we were to speculate that it'll happen in 2024, it would mean that you're looking at around a $40,000 Bitcoin by 2024, which is also what we said back in 2020 when the price was 8K. And we said, look, by the next halving, we should be closer to 40 to 50K for the fair value, something like this, okay? So what that means, what does that mean for you? Well, look, we're already about halfway through 2022, right? 2022 is clearly a bear market year. If you still haven't accepted it, I don't really know what else to say about it. I mean, it looks like a bear market to me. And if it walks like one and it squawks like one, you might as well call it what it is. 2023 will likely just be an accumulation year, right? It'll likely be an accumulation year, gearing up for the next halving. And one thing to consider too is that it actually would work really well with the macro environment, I think. If you think about it, Bitcoin right now is struggling, but a lot of risk on assets are struggling. Why are they struggling? Well, namely inflation, right? I mean, the Fed's raising interest rates, but if you go look at inflation is just kind of out of control, right? It's been out of control, coming in at 8.3% year over year. And so the Fed has to be hawkish, and they're likely going to be raising interest rates by 50 basis points in June and July, and maybe 25 basis points in later months this year, but perhaps they'll pivot in 2023. So let's imagine that Bitcoin is going to be stuck in traffic on Struggle Street as long as the Fed remains hawkish. Let's assume they're going to remain hawkish at least for the remainder of this year, or for at least most of it. You might see the Bitcoin price bottom out at some point, and then start to really enter that accumulation phase as the Fed pivots, and then you go into 2024 with all the with the excitement of the Bitcoin halving. Perhaps the Fed has completely pivoted, and now we're back into quantitative easing, and perhaps we're back on into risk on territory, right? I mean, this is certainly a possibility, and that could lead us into the next mania phase for Bitcoin that ultimately takes us to the six-figure mark. And I know originally we talked about seeing that six-figure mark in 2023, but I don't really see that as a likely possibility at the current time with how hawkish the Fed is. I think that is something we have to consider, is the macro outlook, and I do think that if you think about where we are now and the bear market that we're currently going through, the fact that Bitcoin's price does tend to be around the fair value at the halving. To note that the fair value at the next halving for Bitcoin will be around 40K, which is only $10,000 higher than where we currently are. It would make the most sense to just sort of finish out this bear market over the next several months as we get into the end of the year. Let's say for the next 6 months or so, finish out the bear market, go into an accumulation phase where we don't necessarily see a major rally back up to the all-time highs. I mean, we had a 2019 rally, so we certainly could see something like that where it comes down and then it comes back up, where you get sort of like a fake rally and then back down and then up later on. But I would assume that we'll have some type of an accumulation phase over here before entering into the next bull market will really kick off after the next halving. But remember, the halving will likely not be the cycle bottom. The cycle bottom will likely occur before the next halving. The cycle bottom could be within the next several months, okay? Like it could be in October, it could be in September, it could be in November, it could be December. I mean, maybe it could even be early 2023, but it's likely going to be coming up sometime, in the foreseeable future. And you probably would do yourself some favors to just simply stick around and to just sort of live through that and figure out what type of position you want to have in Bitcoin before we get into the next halving in 2024. So I think it makes sense to look at this, factor in all the macro stuff going on. And the reason I say this is because a lot of people are still FOMOing into altcoins and whatnot because they're constantly looking at these short-term pumps. But as I've said before, the dominance of Bitcoin is likely heading much lower, or sorry, higher, right? The dominance of Bitcoin is likely heading much higher. And if it's heading much higher, which is what we've been saying for months now, then it's likely indicative of a bear market with some bear market rallies, right? I mean, Bitcoin had a bear market rally over here when the Bitcoin dominance continued to go up. So I think the dominance will likely keep going up. This is indicative of a healing market. It'll probably level off at some point, and then it might go up again whenever Bitcoin goes on a rally, and then you might have another alt season later on. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Bitcoin is just sort of choppy right now. I sort of look at this market and think that in the short term, 25K could easily be a local bottom for months to come, right? I mean, it could be. It has been in the past, where you hit a local bottom and then you get some type of a bounce, hit a local bottom and you get some type of a bounce in 2014 and in 2018. So it could be a local bottom for months to come. Doesn't mean it's the market cycle bottom. You could still see some type of final capitulation later on, and then you sort of build out that accumulation phase going into the next Bitcoin halving, where it corresponds to the fair value at approximately $40,000, going into another mania phase as you get into the phase after the next Bitcoin halving. So I just wanted to follow up on these videos. We first introduced this idea back in 2019. It hit the fair value by the 2020 halving, as we showed, and therefore the next one would be to say hit the fourth halving fair value at around 40K. Over here I said 40 to 50K. 50K might be a little bit optimistic, but if we get it, we'll take it. But I would say we should probably be around $40,000 by the next Bitcoin halving. And I'll probably show this video again, in a year or so to see kind of where we are. My guess is that we'll bottom out somewhere, probably somewhere sub 20K, or maybe, best case scenario, it's around 20K or something. I guess best case scenario is 25K, right? But assuming we get another lower low, best case scenario would be 20K but we could ultimately see a capitulation below. And then if we get that rally back up to 40K by the next halving, it could represent like a 100% rally before you get to the fair value at the next Bitcoin halving. And then you could still see that move to six figures between $100,000 to $200,000 in the next bull run. So if we bottom out at 20K and Bitcoin goes up, 5x, it's 100K. If it goes up 10x, it's 200K. Could Bitcoin go up 10x from 20K to 200K? Well, it could. I mean, this most recent bull market, it went up about 20 something x, right? So certainly it could go up, 5x to 10x if it bottoms at 20K or something, and we go up to $100,000 to $200,000 in the next bull run. Just something to consider. I hope this video has been useful. I hope you better understand where the fair value fit to quote unquote non-bubble data comes from. Again, it just comes from the red data points here that are not meant to include these bubble phases, and to just identify what the fair value is fit to non-bubble data, which is not to be confused with a fair value regression band fit to all data, which is better at showing undervaluation and overvaluation and whatnot. So with that in mind, if I pull up the fair value, by the way, it looks something like that, which would also sort of make sense, right? It goes through periods of undervaluation and over, right? Undervaluation and overvaluation. Undervaluation, over, under, over, under, over, right? And it just keeps on going on like that. So there's something beautiful, I think, when you sort of just take a step back and look at it. But really, you have time, right? I mean, Bitcoin could easily pump here and there, have some rallies, but realistically, you still probably have, I would say at least 12 months to really figure out, the conviction you have in Bitcoin gearing up for the next Bitcoin halving. The reason I don't say, 2 years is, again, because normally at the halving, Bitcoin is already potentially off its bottom by 100%. Like, it could already be up 2x by the halving. So I'd say you have about a year to really figure out where you want your stock to be. And I mean, of course, you can continue accumulating after that, but I'm just talking about the best value for getting the most bang for your buck in the next bull market is likely those who stick around for the next year. It's probably going to get somewhat quiet in the cryptoverse. I can see a lot of statistics sort of falling off on my end on social metrics and whatnot. So likely we'll get somewhat quiet, but hopefully we can look back at this video in about a year and be a bit more excited as we head into the next Bitcoin halving. Also, you should know there's still plenty of money to make even during bear markets and accumulation phases. One thing you can always do with altcoins is just recognize you're going to bleed against Bitcoin most likely for a while. Every time I say that, I get in trouble with someone because they always point out some altcoin that's recently pumped against Bitcoin. But if you look at their macro trends, most of them are trending down. So the things you can do right now are figure out the best strategies to optimize your portfolio for the next bull market and sort of just prepare for that over the next year or so and gear up for the next Bitcoin halving as we hopefully head on into another risk-on market, not only for Bitcoin, but also for traditional markets. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe if you're not subscribed. Give the video a thumbs up. Also, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. You will get access to weekly reports and videos, the Telegram alerts channel, the Telegram chat room, the risk dashboard, the website. We have on-chain charts, derivatives, social statistics, etc. Make sure you check it out, intothecryptoverse.com. Lock in the low rate because we do have a sale going on. We'll wrap it up here. Thank you guys for tuning in. I'll see you next time. Bye.